Well, I don't know how many of you have been able to do it this week, but last week we started off and we talked about the triumphal entry. And just the idea that behold your king, right? I mean, I heard him just say it over and over again. I became so fired up about this idea that this one coming in on that day was truly the king. Then all throughout the week, we heard devotionals about what was going on during that particular time to focus our eyes on Jesus. We had our elders pray in the evening to focus our eyes on Jesus. We had a Maundy Thursday, which I had to explain to my kids was not a Monday Thursday, which was pretty confusing for them. That was a good joke, Todd. Good Friday, I only understood about half of it. It was in Spanish and English. Thank you. But then on Saturday, we had a devotion, and again, we prayed, focusing on the King. What's been so interesting for me personally is as I've been walking through a lot of this, I've been asking myself this one question, because I tend to put myself back in those particular times. And I was asking myself this particular question: what do you do when God doesn't show up the way you thought he would? Now, I think all of us know what I'm talking about, right? When those prayers go unanswered, kind of maybe when the healing never comes, when the door shuts that you thought for sure would open, that ache, that confusion, for a lot of us, it isn't something that's new. But I think this is kind of where, when I think about where the resurrection story begins, this is it. Because when you look at this time that was going on in Jerusalem, is that this is what was actually their thought, because the city was alive, right? It was just full of hope. It was electric in me. It was the crowds were lining the streets in all kinds of ways. They were cheering. They were waving palms like they were flags. They were screaming Hosanna. They believed the king had finally come to fix everything. And then Jesus shows up. It just wasn't in the way they expected. He wasn't riding some big, powerful stallion. I mean, that's how I think I would have come into town, on a big, white stallion. He wasn't wearing armor. He wasn't bringing with him an army. When I was listening last week, right, he just shows up on a donkey. And not some just old donkey. He shows up on a foal of a donkey. And instantly my mind, this is where my mind last week, I was like, what would it look like today? And in my mind, what I think it would look like today, if suddenly a general showed up, he wouldn't show up in a tank, he would show up riding a bike. Not just any bike, but a little girl's bike with streamers and a bell. Ding, ding. But think about it, Jesus did this on purpose. He intended to do this, because he came to rescue people, just not in the way that he thought, or they thought that he was going to rescue them. He didn't go to the palace, right? But he did go to the temple. In a lot of ways, right, he wasn't swinging a sword, but man, he was flipping tables. And what's so interesting is he didn't hide from conflict in any kind of a way. Man, in fact, he walked straight into the conflict. He challenged leaders. He told sharp stories. He was coming in and trying to explain to them that their system was broken, and he didn't sugarcoat anything. Every day that week, he just made people more and more uncomfortable, including his followers, not less. And even this tension that he was in, have you ever noticed it when you read it? He never lost control. He kept going. He wasn't trying to take power in any kind of way like others did. He was showing some kind of a different power altogether. See, the people came and they expected him to rise up, but you keep reading this story of Jesus all throughout it, and he just kept going lower and lower and lower as he served people. By the end of the week, right, the cheering had stopped. The crowd was a different one. It was this crowd that was pushed forward by the power from the elite. And just think about it. The juxtaposition, big word kids, doesn't look the same, between Sunday and Friday, where you had a crowd yelling, "Crucify him." They laughed at him. They hit him. They put a royal robe on him to try to make fun of him. They put a crown of heads on his head and they pushed it down. And then they nailed Jesus to a cross. Over his head, they put this big sign that was in Greek, Aramaic, and Latin. They wanted to just make sure everybody knew this. That said, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. It looked awful. I was thinking about that. It looked like a failure. It looked like the end. But what if it wasn't the end? What if this was all part of God's giant plan? What if all of it actually had like meaning in what was going on? Think about it. What if the robe, we were talking about this in sermon prep, what if the robe really did say that he was truly the king? What if the crown that hurt him so greatly when they pressed it down, what if it actually was a crown? What if the sign that was meant to mock him was actually true and declaring something that God wanted the world to know? What if the cross wasn't where he lost, but what if the cross was actually where he won? What if there were two stories happening at the same time? What if one, like people could actually see what was going on, and one only heaven could see? What if the cross actually wasn't a defeat, but in an interesting way, it was a coronation? What if this is where heaven said, "Here is your king," and heaven meant it? Because heaven knew the robe wasn't a joke. Heaven knew that it was royal. Heaven knew the crown wasn't just pain, it was power. Heaven knew that sign wasn't a mistake. It was a message to the entire world. And in an interesting way, this cross, it really was a throne. It was the victory of Jesus. It was what nobody expected. It was love accomplishing what no one else could do, just Jesus. He was the only one, and now it makes sense that as he was lifted up, all people now would be drawn to him. It didn't make sense to them because Jesus didn't come to fight people. He came to fight sin. He came to fight Satan. He came to fight darkness, and he beat them all. He didn't beat them with a sword. He beat them with a cross. Nobody expected that. From where people stood, I can just imagine it looked like such failure. But on Friday night, as I was sitting there listening to Jose Luis, it was God's plan all along, even the suffering. What looked weak was actually God's power at work. What looked like shame was the way God was going to fix everything. I want everybody in this room to understand, Jesus did not lose. He gave himself, and by giving himself, he won the victory that no one saw coming. Not by skipping suffering, but walking straight through it. Not by grabbing control, but by letting go. And it didn't look like anyone thought it would. It wasn't the ending that they were expected, was it? But here's the thing that all of us in this room know. That cross wasn't the end, was it? That cross was only the beginning. And so let's stand up and let's worship the crucified King. I love that statement. Sunday's coming, but they didn't know that, did they? All those guys that were with him, those women that were with him, they didn't realize that this was only the beginning. And so after Jesus died, we know the rest of the story. They took him and they wrapped his body in a cloth and they placed him in a tomb. A dark stone cave cut into the rock. And I was always, again, I'm always trying to think through what were people feeling like, and it must have felt so final. As they watched him go in the tomb somewhere back at a distance, it must have been for them like that feeling like that all hope was gone and it was just over. Saturday was quiet. And when I say quiet, I don't mean like peaceful like we tend to think was. I think like if I were to say it, what Saturday was must have just felt so empty. Jesus was gone. Hope was gone. The world moved on. But for these particular people that were Jesus' friends, you could tell they didn't know what to do next. But then before the sun came up on Sunday, everything changed. We know that the king who died, he stepped out of the grave and he wasn't just alive, but he was reigning in a whole new way. No announcement, right? There was no, in any way, big crowd, just a stone that was rolled away and an empty tomb, not so that he could somehow get out. I was thinking about it this week. The tomb wasn't open so he could get out. God could pass through walls and doors. It was open so that we could see in. The one who is dead is alive. Jesus, he's alive. He's breathing. He's scarred, but he is now stronger than death. And when he stepped out into the morning light in such a whole new way, into a world that we knew that he was not done with yet. But I was thinking about it. He didn't come to rub it in. I totally would have. How you like me now? I think that's what I would have done. He wasn't trying to prove people wrong. He came in to make all things new. He came back to this world to put it back together again in the way that God always intended it should be. I love it too. Some people think he came back as a ghost. He didn't come back as a ghost. He didn't come back as a memory. He came back fully human, but completely new. The way that people were always meant to be. And where does he go first? Notice that he doesn't go to a palace, right? He doesn't show up at the temple. Once again, he didn't go to the places of power. He just went to common people. I was thinking about it. He went to the ones that he lived life with. The ones at that moment that were hurting, the ones at that moment that were confused, the ones at that moment that were scared. No one expected that, but that's exactly where he went. He came in with resurrection life, not in a sermon, not to a temple, but at a table, in fear-filled rooms. And he came amongst this people that thought it was over to tell them, it's not over, it's only the beginning. And to his friends, I love this, right? All these people that scattered, he didn't show up angry like, an angry dad or an angry mom and be like, I told you so. If you read his words, he just came in and said this one word, peace. I love that. Peace. It's not just like a calming word, to not cause them to freak out. It's the kind of word that when he came in, it's a word that puts everything back together. He came in and said peace because it's a word that forgives. It's a word that welcomes. It's a word that restores. And then we know this, that he sat down and he just started to eat with them. He looked at them in the eyes. I was just imagining, right, somebody sitting across from him when he called them by their name. And right there, in that moment, something began that was going to reshape history. Jesus met them in their fear. Not to lecture, like I said, but to restore them. He gave them, like I said, peace. He gave them now in this first moment, he gave them purpose. I get it that the Spirit hadn't come across them yet, but there was something already shifting in that moment, wasn't there? There was something that was changing that would never be the same. And it didn't happen all at once, but it was real. It was not perfect, but the word I was trying to think when I was imagining that scene is it was just like whole. Right. See, he didn't rise up to prove that he could. He rose to reign, not from far away, but by stepping right into our brokenness to make things new. He rose to bring life where there was death and to take on death that had done its worst. He rose to start something brand new in people that are just like us. And that's what resurrection does. It turns fear into courage. It turns doubt into trust. It takes people who are wandering and helps them walk again in a whole new way. It grows slowly but deeply from the inside out. That's what resurrection is. And soon those same people, think about this, that were so afraid to leave the room they were in, 40 days later, they didn't care. They're telling everybody that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Not because they got strong, but because now Jesus, like he had promised in John 14, 15, and 16, was alive in them. What started in the garden, man, I was wrestling this through. Jesus' body that was laying there was not the end. It kept going in these people. And for all of us who are in Christ, it keeps going in us. Jesus didn't come back to life just to come back to life. He came back to life to bring us with him. He didn't just win, he rose to rule, not to leave us behind, but to bring us along. This isn't just his story anymore. Now look at me, everybody check back in if you checked out. This is our story too. We have been invited into resurrection. We have been invited into the greatest story of all time. We have been invited into something that nobody expected, but is changing the world whether they know it or not. And so in light of that, I think it's time to stand up and let's sing to praise Jesus. We jumped from those people back in that day all the way to heaven, and there's a part of me that wishes we were already there. I wish we were already a new creation, but here's the deal. Our job's not done yet. See, that group of people that started off that day, they were very normal people. But those people are those ones that then, as they begin to engage within those within their community, it began to spill out. But it began to spill out, not of the powerful, not of the maybe the ones that we might thought it would be. It began to spill out of these normal people. Not flawless people, I don't ever want to think that. But full of people that were shaped by Jesus. People learning to live, maybe we put it this way, like the tomb is actually empty. And honestly, every time that I see somebody live like the tomb is still empty, it still surprises me. I don't know why. Because like I've been saying, this resurrection power doesn't always show up the way that we would expect it. It doesn't always show up, like if you think about it, with something that's shiny or maybe something that's strong or something that's loud. Sometimes it just shows up in quiet, like faithfulness. Sometimes it looks like sacrifice that nobody else will ever see. Sometimes it looks like a life that only makes sense if Jesus Christ really did rise again. I think it looks like a guy whose friends called him Wilbur. Oh, I would have beat that kid up in school. He had money, he had privilege, he had a comfortable future in front of him. His family had everything. And for a while, this guy, what he chose to do is he's like, I'm gonna live in comfort, and that's what he did. But then something amazing happened. He met Jesus, and something shifted. The resurrection started to reshape how he cared about the world. And the thing about him is that when he came to know Jesus, he couldn't escape the pain that was going on around him. He couldn't ignore the evil of slavery anymore. If Jesus really rose from the dead, then injustice wasn't just a problem, it was a defeated enemy, and he intended to join Jesus in making sure the defeat took place. He stepped into the problem when no one else would, and in many ways, he quietly stepped in, he faithfully stepped in, he rose to some of the highest positions of parliament within Great Britain at that time. He invested all kinds of time in eradicating evil. It took years, it cost him so much, but he kept going, because this is the thing you need to understand about resurrection, is that it does not give up. It frees, it restores, it endures, and that man is known from history as William Wilberforce, doing what God called him to do. And then there's a teenager named Patricius. He's not a teenager in this picture. He had a great life until raiders showed up in his village. They kidnapped him. They sold him as a slave. They took him far from home to Ireland. He gets there and he lived on cold hills as a slave. He was watching sheep. He wrote later in his life that he was praying to a God that he really kind of didn't even know. But in that lonely place, something happened to him. Later in life, he wrote about the fact that he came to believe that Jesus Christ had really risen from the dead, and that's what gave him hope inside of slavery. Years later, God, in a dream, began to whisper to him, "Run." He took off out of slavery. He made it home. He was free. But instead of staying away, God spoke in a dream to him again and said, "Go back." And he went back, not to get even, but to share the love of Jesus. Because if resurrection is real, even enemies can become family. We celebrated his life a month ago, St. Patrick. He's more than beer. I was thinking about it, right? One came from privilege. One came from pain. One had to put down power. One had to put down bitterness. But what's so interesting about these two guys is both chose the resurrection because they believed Jesus Christ really rose from the dead. And both found themselves following a king who gave everything, who won by losing, and they entered into the world in that very way, doing the exact same thing. And that's what the resurrection life is. But it didn't stop with them. We know this, man. Whether it's the early church, whether it's the St. Patrick cat, or whether it's William Wilberforce, it didn't stop with them. It's still happening today all over the world, in quiet homes, in busy schools, in workplaces, in parks, in moments most people will never, ever see. See, Wilberforce and St. Patrick, right? They didn't set out to become important people. That's not what they were trying to do. They were just living in response to the risen Jesus. They believed it. And history just somehow, I would say this, just happened to notice. See, resurrection, it doesn't wait for significance. It shows up in ordinary lives of faith. Resurrection kept moving into places like ours, into people like us. It's the mom, right, who gets up before the sun and crashes after everyone is asleep, who does dishes and folds laundry and makes lunches and whispers prayers over her kids at night. She's not chasing fame or anything like that. She's just pouring out love because resurrection starts in the ordinary, and she's living as if Jesus was alive towards her family. It's the dad who chooses presence over escape. He leans into that house, and any dad ever knows that you come home sometimes, right? It's just chaotic. Emotions are running high. Your wife looks at you and says, "I'm out, you're in." And despite his day, he listens. He says he's sorry. He chooses kindness even when he's exhausted, because Jesus' way of strength looks more like patience than like power. And he's walking in it. There's this college student who risks standing alone, who notices the lonely on campus, who chooses serving over being seen, who believes the way of Jesus is still the best way to be human because the resurrection changes everything. It's the adult child who cares for the memory of, or cares for the mom or the dad whose memory is slipping, who answers the same questions over and over again, who chooses compassion instead of frustration, because that's what love looks like when resurrection takes root. And I get it, none of these stories will ever trend, right? It won't go viral. But I believe that in those moments, heaven sees. And the more that I read the book of Ephesians, I'm convinced that when God's people live like that, hell shakes. Because that's what resurrection looks like. Ordinary people responding to the risen Jesus with quiet faithfulness. Not flashy, not famous, but faithful. And I believe deep in my gut, I mean this, I believe God is rewriting the world through stories like this, one person at a time. That's why this matters. Because when the church remembers this, when we actually live like Jesus is alive, I get it in a lot of ways. It may not always look spectacular, but it is unmistakably beautiful. Let me be crystal clear. The church is not perfect. We haven't always lived up to this reality. The church has scars. It makes mistakes. But I want to be crystal clear about this, that because Jesus Christ is alive, so is the church. It is a group of people to which death and Hades and hell cannot stop it. And when it actually lives like Jesus is alive, when we live the resurrection, it is absolutely undeniable. But also, listen carefully, the resurrection life only makes sense if Jesus really rose from the grave, if he really reigns now, and if he's inviting us into this upside down, backwards way of living today. And I think that's the victory no one saw coming. The question isn't whether resurrection still works, it's whether we'll trust it, whether we'll live like it's true. Right here, right now, in lives that no one may ever see, but heaven will and hell will shake, and all God's people said, let's sing. With everybody just standing here, there's 3 people I want to talk to as we get ready to leave. Some of you, man, you've made your life about following Jesus, and I love that. But don't forget to renew your heart in this reality. He is risen. Let me say it again. He is risen. Thank you. From the mouth of babes. Another group of people I want to talk to are someone that I used to be. I'll never forget, somebody came up to me at church one time before I walked with Jesus, and they said, oh man, like, have you ever been to church? And I go, yeah, usually I go Christmas or Easter. They said, oh, you're a keister. I was like, you're funny. I think there's some of you in this room that this is when you show up. And can I just talk to you real quick? That's not living like Jesus rose from the dead. If you really believe Jesus rose from the dead, make your life about it. Join Jesus and join his people in what he's doing in this world. And those for you that maybe have showed up and you really don't know who this Jesus is, maybe you're even inspired. You're like, dang, that St. Patrick guy, man, I didn't realize that. I thought it was more than beer. I didn't realize about this William Wilberforce dude. That's cool. That inspires me. I want you to know something. It's not about trying harder. It's not about pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. It's not about in some way coming to this best version of yourself. The only way you will ever be the resurrection people is to come bow before the King that was raised from the dead. It's not about all these things, even religious things. It's about knowing this King in the way that he's asked us to love him. And so if you're somebody here that maybe has just lost sight of the resurrection, maybe you are somebody that comes back maybe twice a year, maybe you're somebody sitting there going, you know what? If this Jesus is really offering life like that, I want it. That room over there, we call it the prayer room. We can't answer every question, but we can pray with you. Don't leave today. Nobody expected what Jesus brought, but you do. Nobody thought he was going to have happen what happened, but now you do. What are you going to do with it? That's the question. All of us in this room have to decide what we're going to do with the risen King. Amen?